Martin, in a few words, what do you think are the core challenges for genuine digital government transformation?
It's an interesting question, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to come to the sessions, but it's great to have an opportunity, virtually at least, to contribute. I think we've reached a very interesting conundrum at the moment around the digital transformation debate, and it's a little bit like the early days of e-government when everyone used to say, let's drop the E and let's just talk about government. I was part of that movement, and I was a very strong believer in that because I came into this debate from the government side, if you like. And yet what we've done is not really drop the E, I think. What we've done is evolve the E, and now we talk about Gov 2.0. Now we're talking about digital transformation. And in a way, we keep insisting on putting the digital or the technology piece in the picture. And I'm beginning to wonder whether that's not a bit of a problem, because the more we do that, I think we're beginning to get the balance wrong between the technology part of this and the government part of this.
You've described that as something of a paradox.
I think it is a strange paradox in the sense that in the digital conversation about transforming government, there seems to be a lot going on. In fact, it's not difficult to be almost overwhelmed by the amount of activity that's going on. But I'm wondering whether anything's actually happening. And by that I mean, are we really deeply reforming and transforming the nature and work and institutional settings of government? And I'm beginning to worry that in all of this wonderful activity, and much of it is fantastic, I'm wondering whether we're really getting deep into the genuine transforming of the institution.
You've referred to this as the difference between doing digital and being digital.
Yeah. It's an interesting observation, and I should give credit for that. It actually came in a conversation I had with a fellow called William Murphy, who used to be the Deputy Secretary here in New South Wales that looked after these matters. And I agree with William very much that to some extent we've been very good at doing digital. In fact, we're getting much better at it. But broadly speaking, doing digital is kind of adding a bit of digital onto what we already do.
Right.
Being digital basically requires you to think about how you would do a particular action or activity in government as if you were at the beginning of the digital transformation process right from the start. And you may do it very, very differently. You may not even do that action at all. You may do something completely different. Being digital is about a mindset. Doing digital is just basically adding some interesting bells and whistles to what you're doing now.
So how do we get the really senior policymakers in government and the political level of government thinking about being digital rather than doing digital?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's an important sign of where this conversation needs to go. So my observation would be that people who are deeply engaged in the business of governing and government and public sector, you know, when you think about their day, what is their day? Their day tends to be focused on having to make difficult calls, judgment calls, discernment, sifting often very complex evidence, navigating through very, very complicated terrains of value clashes and interests and all the rest of it. It's a very complex world they live in. Now, without at all wishing to suggest that, you know, everything they do is fine, because clearly there's a lot that they could do a lot better, I think sometimes we don't, as digital kind of evangelists, if you like, and we can sometimes get a bit evangelical about this stuff, which again is a little bit of an issue, I think. We get a bit self-righteous to some extent about, you know, if it's digital, it's good, and if it's not digital, it must be bad. This is not a good way to go to somebody whose job it is to be, if you like, the world that you're trying to disrupt. So you've got to really deeply understand the difficult, complex, contested world in which many, many senior policymakers are having to live. If you show some sign that you are prepared to make the almost emotional effort to get into their world, and then work back with them to say, okay, I get the complexity that you're trying to navigate here, but there's stuff around the digital way of thinking that really could help give you the kind of respect and relevance and recognition that you're looking for. Let's see if we can work something out. Totally different conversation. What I'm beginning to see more of, I must say, from at least some elements of the digital transformation debate is almost a kind of arrogant kind of disrespect that says, look, you people are just, you know, you're behind the 8 ball, you're way off the beat, just step back. You know, what you need is lots and lots of digital stuff and somehow or other, you know, government will be transformed. It just doesn't seem to me to be that simple. And I think instinctively, people who are deep in the government business, they recoil from that stuff. And the harder we push, the harder we chase them, no, we've got lots more things we can, the more they seem to almost sort of run in the opposite direction. That's my slight concern, and I guess I'm beginning to feel that we haven't quite got that balance right.
You've said that the future of government is government. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it is a good question, and it's really something I've been grappling with a fair bit. I'll give a quick analogy. I read an interesting piece recently about the future of retail.
Yes.
I follow this digital debate all over the place. And I read this piece and I thought, yeah, I suppose at one level, when you look at it, the future of retail is probably digital in one level. But actually, it seems to me the future of retail is retail. Now, digital will come along and it will disrupt and it will come up with some astonishing stuff that we've never even thought about. And, I'm sure if I was a retailer, I'd think to myself, yeah, my whole future is going to be determined to some extent. And that's partly true. But actually, the future of retail is what it is we think retail will become in the next 10 or 20 years. It's exactly the same in government, I think. I think people who work in government get very frustrated when people from the digital end of the conversation come and tell them that the future of their business is this digital business that people in government don't understand. And I think that's a really risky way of putting it. The future of government is government, what we want government to do in the next 10, 20, 30 years. Doing good government well is the game. Now, the digital question is, what do we as digital evangelists, innovators, entrepreneurs, brilliant thinkers, whatever we think we are, and I'm definitely one of them, I'm a deep believer in this conversation, what is it we bring to that task of doing good government well? That's the game. And the future of doing that is the future of doing that. What do we bring to that conversation? If we start there, I suspect as digital change makers, shape shifters, if you like, we'll get a much better hearing from people who will immediately hear that we understand that the future of their business is their business. Our job is to help that future emerge much more effectively, much more powerfully, and much more impactfully than it might otherwise do. And that's what I'm suggesting we have to say to ourselves. The future of government is not digital. The future of government is government. Digital brings something quite profound to that equation. That's kind of where I think we've got to play in the future.
So in talking about the future of government is government, there must be a great deal of complexity under that statement. What are some of the points of complexity?
Well, I'm glad you asked me that because I did think about that a bit before we had this conversation. And I kind of reflected on my own experience, having spent on and off the last 30 years either working inside government or with government officials and politicians, and then obviously reflecting over the last little period. So if I can just quickly refer to the kind of quick thoughts I put down. So these would be what I would put on the table. A focus on making policy better, designing services with impact and equity, using evidence more systematically to inform practice and outcomes, attracting and retaining requisite talent, conceiving and protecting what the public interest is or the common good. This is a very, very complicated business in government, and it's core, it seems to me, to what we want governments to do. This idea of kind of voting for the future, thinking long term, that's another thing they need to do. How do we work with crowds of experts, people with real insight that we need to corral? How do we fight big issues around things like inequality? I think too, just rescuing issues like trust and legitimacy. I mean, I think we're seeing around the world at the moment, my goodness, we live in the age, as somebody I read recently in the paper, the age of distrust, right? This is becoming an absolutely central business challenge for government. It really is. And unless we understand that as digitalists, if you like, unless we get on board with that kind of collection of things that drive the deep heart of government, we're going to struggle, I think, to be invited into their world. And that's part of my challenge about where we've been with this conversation. We keep pushing to get into their world, but I think perhaps sometimes not spending as much time and energy and almost emotional energy, empathy, to understand that's the world they live in. That is the business of government. What do we have to help them do that?
Another good point, and I think really at the core of your discussion, is the idea that if digital is changing everything in government, why isn't everything changing?
Yes, I love paradoxes. Someone said to me the other day, we live in an age of transition, right? We're in the transition. And they said to me, the defining characteristic of transitions is paradox. Two apparently opposite things both being true. So it's interesting. There does seem to be a lot going on, and yet somehow things aren't changing. My own sense is that I don't think we've quite got the balance right between a kind of digital determination to get stuff done. And I think about the work I've witnessed, obviously here to some extent in New South Wales and in federally, the Digital Transformation Office, fantastic energy and commitment. Go and look at the story for Government Digital Service in the UK. And I've read recently some stuff that Mike Bracken, the former head of GDS, in fact, I think there was an article in the Mandarin a little while ago, who made the point that we've barreling along trying to get work done, projects done, and that's the best way to get progress. And yet I don't think we're spending enough time to really understand the deep sources of power and influence and structural, kind of the architecture almost. We're sort of saying, yeah, we're kind of busy doing projects, right? We're busy digitising bits of government. So, stay tuned, we'll come back to you and let you know how that's going. And of course, the more we do that, the more everyone will stand back and say, wow, that's terrific, we now get it. Well, I think maybe that's not working as well as it might, because we seem to be leaving a large part of the conversation unattended, which is deep, respectful, but demanding conversations with people who are at what I would call the commanding heights of power and influence across the public sector. And my experience, directly, as somebody who knows a few of those people and works with them, but my anecdotal evidence back is that they are still sceptical about how this new game plays into their world. And to that extent, yes, there's a lot of activity going on, but are we genuinely doing what Mike Bracken himself said in this article? He felt he was trying to reform the institutions of government from within. Well, good, that's great. Question is, how do you do that most effectively? And frankly, how would you know whether you're really being successful? And I get mixed stories about quite how purposeful and effective that's being. So I think we've got to think about our game plan a little bit.
Getting at the distinction between projects that deliver low-hanging fruit, the quick wins, the things that might get out to citizens really quickly, versus those projects that would require deep system thinking, institutional change, maybe even legislative change. Can those two types of digital transformation project coexist? And should we be doing both of them at the same time?
Yeah, great question. The answer is they have to coexist, and to some extent, they need to go on at the same time. And in fact, if you think about it, for a couple of seconds, they each inform each other. That's the point. Now, my concern is that, so I absolutely believe in the power of getting stuff done. Show me, don't tell me. I get that. Prototypes, I'm all on board with that. Terrific. And yes, there is a worry sometimes, and I see this criticism a lot, that government tends to sit around too often talking about what to do. Whereas the digitalists, we just say, no, let's do something, and that will help the conversation along. I get that. But I don't think we've got the balance right between this kind of system-level conversation, which is deep and long and tough, and all the rest of it needs to be persistent, and lots of activity. And perhaps we're not very good at the way they feed into each other. I think the trouble is, we have showcases where people say, wow, look at these last 5 projects we did in the last 6 months. And everyone steps back and says, wow, that's terrific. But I'm not sure that we're very good at then saying, yes, but those 6 projects now mean that systemically, deep in the architecture of our business, something has shifted. Let me be clear about that. And I don't think we make those connections perhaps as much as we might. So I think they are completely connected. They need to be progressed in parallel, not serially. I get that. So it's not like we say, look, we'll get to the deep system conversation later. Right now I'm busy with 40 projects. Leave me alone. And when I've done 40 projects, wow, you will stand back in wonder and we'll all be off. I don't think it's going to work that way. You've got to actually keep these loops going all the time at the same time. I don't know whether that makes sense. It feels right to me. And I don't think we've quite got that balance to some extent, to the point where we may actually be undermining our own capacity to really shift what we say we want to shift. I don't know if we're doing it as well as we might.